We can call this session to order. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar on this still rather windy, brisk, still winter day. My name is Eric Arneson. I'm from George Washington University, and I am co-chair of this seminar. And joining me moderating today is Roger Lewis of the University of Texas at Austin, who was the founding chair of the Washington History Seminar some 9 years ago, and its leading spirit for many years. As many of you know, but some of you do not know, the Washington History Seminar is a joint project of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. We are now in our 9th year of holding these sessions, which take place weekly during the academic year. Now, the seminar thanks to the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest, as well as the History Department of George Washington University for their financial support. We always encourage donors, anonymous or otherwise, who make these sessions possible, and we welcome your contributions should you be so inclined. Information is on the back of the announcement sheet found outside of this doorway. So details are there for you to consider. Behind the scenes, there are a number of individuals we like to thank weekly, folks whose efforts make these seminars possible. The Assistant Director of the National History Center is Jeff Rieger, who is newly on board with the program. Pete Bierstecker of the History and Public Policy Program here at the Wilson Center is a stalwart who we rely upon heavily. And we have two interns, Soo-Yeon Kim and Kyle Nichols, who will be walking around with microphones during the question and answer period. I also want to welcome Dane Kennedy, the director of the National History Center at George Washington University, at that end of the table. Last piece of business, you all will have to admit you have one of these, right? Everybody got one of these? Okay, you take it out and make sure it is on silent or on vibrate. We would very much appreciate it so as not to disturb the seminar. And with that, Roger Lewis will introduce today's speaker. Roger.
I'm very glad to have the chance to introduce Dr. Lemay. She is a historian and curator at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. She is also the director of the Portrait Gallery's Scholarly Center and the coordinating curator of the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative. Her book, Triumph of the Dead, American World War II Cemeteries, Monuments, and Diplomacy in France, received the 2018 Terra Foundation in American Art Publication Award. She has published essays with the International Journal of Military History and Historiography, the Journal of War and Cultural Studies, the University of Texas Press, and not least, the Marine Corps History Division. Dr. Lemay.
Thank you. This is so exciting to be here, and I'm sort of a teacher at heart, so I'm going to teach from my slides. This is the most important part of today's presentation, so I want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable, they can see, because I'm an art historian and I rely on images and objects. So in today's discussion, the lay of the land is going to be to tell you about my method, because not everyone really understands social art history and what we do. My argument, we're going to take into consideration World War I cemeteries, and then do a deep dive into World War II cemeteries and their designs, and compare them to other nations, and finally look at their diplomacy and their agency in diplomacy. So I'm just going to teach and talk, and after 45 minutes I will pause and I will accept questions. So let's begin. Framing questions that I ask: how has the built environment affected the way in which politics are staged, communicated, and received? So I'm looking at material culture, and I'm wondering what their effect is on people, on visitors, on people, the audiences. How is this approach uniquely American? So I study American art, and I want to know why the United States, what's our unique approach? How do American war cemeteries compare with other cemeteries from different nations? And my argument is that American war cemeteries have influenced diplomatic relations. That's the big kind of argument. And some people have a hard time with that because these are innate objects, but I really believe that they have major influence. And so within social art history, this is my method. The art object is a window into war memory. And so I'm asking questions like money, who's paying for these cemeteries? Like commissioning, who is in charge of the designs? Audience, who's the intended audience? And then I put plural, because of course there are more than one. And political context, what are the socioeconomic political climates? So France, the Cold War, American global power. So France is my case study. I'm fluent in French, and there's so many war cemeteries in Europe that I just couldn't do them all. So I just decided to kind of narrow my focus on the war cemeteries in France, and I didn't realize when I started out this project that in fact there are 24 temporary American cemeteries in France. And so here's a map of them. You can see these little crosses. So in little tiny places like Verroy, Saint-Juan, probably places you've never heard before, Montélimar, Lugne, Draguignan. So I wanted to know, okay, that's interesting, from this very kind of short period, 1944 to 1949, what did the French do with these cemeteries? What were the Americans doing with these cemeteries? How were they visited? Around, between 1947 and 1949, about 62–64% of American soldier dead were repatriated. And so this is a long story, but basically next of kin were able to opt where their fallen soldier would be permanently interred. And so a major, I would say, campaign was on behalf of the American Battle Monuments Commission, which is in charge of these cemeteries and still maintains them to this day. They were trying to convince American citizens to leave their dead, leave their boys in France or in Europe, or as it were in the Pacific Theater. Today we have these 6 permanent war cemeteries in France. These are my photos, so they're not awesome, but you know, you can kind of see they've got major monuments, they're neoclassical, you have lots and lots and lots of endless rows upon rows of graves. And they're really well designed. They're really, really well designed. And so when I was starting out my dissertation research in 2007, when I met Tom Cavaness, right here, who was the superintendent of the AP-Now American Cemetery, I was basically trooping around, walking for miles, because I couldn't afford to get anywhere. And he gave me a ride, which is super nice of him, I still remember that. But the question I had was, well, who built these? And why, you know, how did these architects even get hired? And how did these designs even get done? No one could answer my questions. So again, just to remind you, my scope was, okay, so we went from this temporary kind of cemetery without these high design to these permanent, beautiful places that we know today. And this, if you're familiar with World War II history, this is the the burial ceremony of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who died of a heart attack. And he was kind of the mastermind of Utah Beach, the landing there. So on the left, you've got the temporary war cemeteries, and on the right, you have the permanent. So you can see many, many, many crosses here. If you can see that far, I'm not sure. And then here you only have just a handful, 6 in France from 24. So let's walk it back a little bit. I'm going to talk about World War I and who the change makers really were. Anyone recognize this gentleman here? Blackjack Pershing. And he's standing with Paul Cret, who was a French-born citizen, architect, and fought for France during World War I, but brought the Beaux-Arts, so brought this sort of way of teaching architecture to the United States through the University of Pennsylvania in the beginning of the 20th century. And then on the right, you have, this is, anyone know who this is? This is Thomas North, who was sort of the equivalent of second in command of the ABMC, which is the organization, again, that kind of designed and maintained these cemeteries. And his consulting architect, who was the equivalent of Paul Cray, so that's John Harbison. Kind of mind blank there. So this is World War II, World War I. World War I set the stage, obviously, for World War II. There was a lot of knowledge gained from these designs that we made after World War I. John Pershing was really the mastermind, and I recently read a great book by Thomas Connor, and he lays it out for you about Pershing's influence. Pershing was the secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission, which is the smallest agency in the executive government. You might not know a lot about it, but it has a presidential appointee. So he served as secretary from 1923 to 48 till his death. He selected the sites for the cemetery. So he arranged the purchase of about 110 acres of French land for about $27,000 and the right to use them in perpetuity. And that's really important. For monuments, he insisted on the inclusion of a map. So I'm obsessed with maps. I think they're so interesting, so fascinating. And Pershing apparently was too, because these monuments have maps and they are beautiful. Pershing also wanted to regulate design, as he recalled the monstrosities built after the Civil War. He was aghast with sort of the kitsch that was created to commemorate war dead from the Civil War. And he oversaw the regulation of private memorials. He understood art was a political tool during World War I. So this is Fred Spear's Enlist from 1915. And if you've read David Lubin's book on World War I and American art, he does a great job situating this not only as a reaction after the sinking of the Lusitania, but also as a reaction to women gaining a lot more power in society. So you've got this incredible suffragist artist, Nasa McMain, and this is one of her posters that she designed. So she was really interested in women's empowerment. And as my research assistant Nicola right here knows, I'm obsessed with suffragists right now because I'm curating a show that's about to open on them at the Portrait Gallery. So I had to put in my suffrage stick here. This is John Stuart Curry, Parade to War from 1918. So it's a really frightening painting. You can see the soldiers look like skeletons. So there's a lot of different takes about war in art, and Pershing was very refined. He knew about all of these works. So John Singer Sargent's Gas was made in 1919. It's not just the blind leading the blind, but he's also looking at the effects. So this poor young man is vomiting after being exposed to mustard gas. So there's a lot of protest art, in other words, that's being created. And so Pershing's aware of these contexts, and he knows about how artists can create a rhetoric that supports war or questions war. This is Horace Pippin, who fought with the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, damaged his right arm, and then taught himself how to paint during and after the war. And what I like about the dogfight over the trenches that Pippin painted, you can see kind of these gentlemen, these soldiers watching, you know, basically the killing of another soldier, and the plane goes down and explodes. And here in the background of Sargent's painting, what do you see? What are these guys doing? Can anyone see? They're playing soccer. Maybe we could close this blind. Peter, there's Kyle, thank you so much. Is that, maybe, it's hard to see these things. So where the USA began in 1919 to about 1925 was these order from a catalog type monuments. And they were getting ordered from the catalog and placed in France. And they were crumbling. So crumbling monuments to our dead in France, soon to be replaced by worthy memorials. So there was obviously like a press release, because I found a couple of articles from June 7th, 1925 that talk about the design program of these cemeteries in France. So John Pershing kind of is the mastermind of what public memory is going to look like. And so he devised American memory priorities for a European audience to be seen in war monuments and in war cemeteries. 1, must be legible. So use of symbols that everyone understands. It's really important for him. 2, must be well cared for in perpetuity. So no crumbling monuments. Thank you very much. 3, must have hierarchical correspondence to historic battle. Not quite so successful in this third point, but that's okay. He wanted there to be hierarchy. Chateau Thierry is a little bit bigger than, say, Montfaucon, so he failed in that endeavor, but that's okay. 4, must act as appropriate representatives of the United States to a foreign audience. Interestingly, Pershing was responsible for the non-segregation of American war cemeteries. So enlisted were buried next to the officers. Caucasian were buried next to African Americans, etc. So here we have the beginning points. This is in the Aisne-Marne American Cemetery, located right in Bellewood. This is really spooky. I was staying there for the night, and the superintendent was allowing me to stay in this extra apartment that they had, where John Pershing stayed when he was in France. So I felt like I was communing with Pershing's ghost. It was very cool, but it was very spooky. What's interesting about these headstones is that they were designed in 1924. So you've got 2 options: Latin cross, Star of David. Latin cross obviously is Christian. Star of David, obviously Jewish. So I wanted to know what about everybody else, because it's kind of interesting. And what happened was there was a congressional hearing, and a bunch of people, including David A. Reed, who was a senator of Pennsylvania, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 limiting immigration, they proposed that the Latin cross be used as the permanent headstone design in 1924. So this is while they're still like sort of ramping up for the World War I designs. And so that's what they got. They got these 2 designs. There were very empowered rabbi who also organized to at least advocate for a Jewish option for soldiers of the Jewish faith. But the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 limits immigration. And so there's a lot of white nationalism in play in the 20s. So there's an interesting kind of argument to be made there about this kind of impulse of how to bury American soldiers who weren't necessarily Christian. And again, Tom was the one who pointed out to me in AP Now, the 442nd, 443rd Tank Brigades, Japanese American, not all of those soldiers were Christian, but they're all buried under the Latin cross. And I wondered about that. I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. And I think today and Wednesday, actually, in Maryland, you have that peace cross that's being held up to the Supreme Court of Maryland, because the Humanist Society is questioning why there's a religious symbol on public land. And so there's a whole lawsuit. So this is something that I think is going to haunt the ABMC at some point. But I didn't bring it up. This is an interesting example. So this is a headstone in the Surrey American Cemetery, and I'll read the inscription. He had the power sufficient to his dream. This is an inscription from the Commonwealth. We could not say goodbye, but we would give the world to say hello to you today, mother, dad, and all. So this is one of the very few inscriptions on the backs of American headstones. I think what happened was there was an allowance of 60 letters, like the Commonwealth, but American families had to pay for it. So that immediately created a hierarchy in the socioeconomic levels of who got remembered and how. And the other, so they're quoting like Shakespeare, and they're quoting like these 19th century scholars that kind of signified a certain social status amongst those who knew. And the other thing that they would do is write killed in action. So what does that do for World War I? It distinguishes who died in death from battle and who died a less glorious death from disease. So there was a lot of kind of unlovely politics going on, so they just decided to stop it. But the Commonwealth somehow handled it really well. What do you think they did differently? It was free. It's free. So everybody put what they, there's some incredibly moving inscriptions in these headstones. But World War I, World War II, all the headstones from American war cemeteries are the same. So this is something uniquely American. What else is kind of different? What else is uniquely American? Anyone have a?
Distinct.
They're distinct, but they're distinct because they're white. They're white marble. So imagine ferro-concrete. This looks really, really bad when it starts to crumble, and it crumbles. So the French have all these ferro-concrete headstones on their hands that they have to deal with. Interestingly, the French do distinguish Muslims and people of non-Christian faith. The Germans, this is about the closest type of information that there is to the American headstone. But the American headstone does not give date of birth, just the date of death.
Oh, that's right.
So you have to, and also the state is not always where the soldier was from, but rather where he was enlisted, or the nurse. So let's jump into World War II American cemeteries. Unlike World War I, they each include a battle map within the cemetery's bounds. So this is where I get all art historian on you. Are you ready? They employ the design strategy of a threshold. Okay, I'm going to teach you. Here we are in Épinal. This is my favorite American War cemetery because it is really exquisite in terms of its design. Here you have these big, big, big bas-reliefs. The inscription here is citizens of every calling bred in the principles of American democracy. At the top on the attic, it says, I bear you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. So Exodus, there's a lot of citations of the Bible. This is called war. On the left, the bas-relief, and on the right is sacrifice. So soldiers heading off to war, soldiers being buried and ascending. Yes?
And keeping the tradition of integrating both by race and by rank?
Yep, always. So if you're familiar with the Épinal, Vosges area, this is hard fighting. This is where the Japanese tank battalions I was talking about earlier, this is where their whole unit was awarded medals for valor because they did such an incredible job. This is the Moselle River, very, very mountainous, kind of hilly fighting terrain. Lots and lots of harsh weather. It was just an incredibly difficult battle. So here is where you drive up. So this is the Moselle River. This is kind of an overlook. You drive up here, you park, and then you kind of walk in, and that memorial building is here, and then the graves are here. So this is the threshold design. In other words, the memorial building creates a threshold through which you must pass before you see the graves. And what is the memorial building teaching you? Before we do this, actually, let's look at the Lorraine American Cemetery with this very scary, kind of less incredible art and architecture. How do you get to the graves area? This is the graves area. Let me test you. Where's your threshold? How's your approach? Where are you approaching? At the top?
Bottom.
The bottom.
Yeah.
This is the memorial building here. So you're coming up,
Yeah.
you have to pass by the memorial building, and then you get to the graves.
Right.
Every cemetery from World War II is designed like this. So here's my slide explaining. If you didn't quite follow me, I like arrows. So you've got the approach, you're exposed to messages, and then you get to the graves. So let's talk about how Malvina Hoffman, who carved these bas-reliefs, How was she coached? This was her first design, and this was her second and final design. So on the top left, what do you see and what do you not see? First, yeah?
Well, you can see the stonework in the first one.
You can see the stonework, I like that. Yeah, because she was kind of mathematical and she was thinking about like how the stone was laying. This is what a lot of artists do to kind of make sure that they're precise. Yeah?
You can't see faces in the first one.
You can't see the faces, you only see the backs. You only see a bunch of legs. And for an artist, she was interested in rhythm, in patterning, in design. But the ABMC commissioners and the lead consulting architect and sculptor said, no, 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 we need to see the faces. So she reoriented, like a good soldier, she wrote in her notes. And she created this. And so here you've got the guns of war, the man throwing a grenade, it's on the radio here, the overarching United States cover, you know, the eagle, all the marching men with their faces seen, and then these three charging men. And she studied, actually, she took photographs of veterans in their uniforms with their real guns, or, you know, guns that were part of the war. And then she also studied these swinging guys from the parachutes from popular magazines of the time. It's very cool to get into her archives. Okay, so left, and then the final. So what's going on the left? Anyone remember your Renaissance art history? What is the mother figure doing?
Pieta.
So that's this one. What about this one? I know, it's confusing. She's lamenting. It's the lamentation. Giotto, anyone? Remember? Yes. So you got sort of the lamentation. She's burying the soldier. She's mourning. She's sorrowful. She's crying. Boo hoo. It's not happy. Does the ABMC like this? No. No. What does the ABMC prefer her to do? This is the Pietà, where she's holding him in her lap, right? So the famous Pietà is in Rome by, starts with a B, Bernini. Is it ringing a bell? Kind of?
Yes.
Okay. I should have put a Bernini in here, and I thought to, and then I forgot. And then what are these guys doing? They're not in the ground. They're
Ascending.
They're ascending, right? So it's the ascension. Okay, you are obviously not very good Christians and religious people back here. I mean, there's a lot of religious symbolism here. So there's a lot of messaging that's very specific to, let's talk about audience in a little bit. So the bas-reliefs are on the exterior, and then on the inside, on this part of the chapel, there's a chapel on the right, and on the left is what's called the battle map room. This is where my jaw hits the floor, I get really excited. This is by Eugene Savage, who was a professor of painting at Yale, who did incredible murals in Harrisburg, in the state capitol complex, if anyone's been there. And so I interviewed his grandson, Gene Crawford, who helped his grandfather cut these panels. You can kind of see them. Again, squares, like the masonry, and literally baked these things and cut them into like 600,000 pieces, and then glued them to brown paper and shipped them over to France in squares, numbered. So this is, a kind of a mathematical process as well. So what do you see here on the left? What's that figure doing?
Raising
a sword, yes. And she's striding onto the continent.
yes, shield.
Yes.
Sword.
Shield, sword, lightning bolts.
With lightning in it.
She's wearing what kind of cap?
Phrygian.
It's the
Liberty cap, as well as a sword. So the Liberty cap is what? French or American? French. Phrygian cap. But she's also wearing something on her chest. And I'll just tell you because it's too hard to see. This is the seal of the United States. So she's France and she's the United States. She's Columbia and she's Marianne. She's Minerva And she's all these things. I know, please, come and like take a look, because I know it's frustrating if you can't see it. And then, so Savage is Catholic and is kind of oddly obsessed with like bleeding hearts and
Wait, so the one on
bodies.
the right is,
This is all one thing. This is me like trying to be.
I love that they have the plates like they do, you know, in typical early Christian painting.
Yes,
And they still have
very
these
much
plates, you know, the plates over them.
So she's talking about these really cool schematic lines too, that are Byzantium. So we can get into like mid-century modern cool architecture. They had all these revivals. So here you see, I should have fast forwarded earlier, but this is the coat of arms of the United States, right, the seal, and the Phrygian cap. And she's like, don't mess with this lady, because you're gonna get your rear end removed. Right? That's the message. Don't mess with her.
Woman as Amazon.
Woman as Amazon, exactly. And so she's landing, this is the Mediterranean, this is the beaches of Provence. She's coming up, this is the US 7th Army. And then they're gonna meet, you know, the First Army from Normandy, and then they're all gonna go into Germany. Very good. So she's under the guns of war. This is the study. So I'm like marching around in Connecticut, getting to this thing. I think this got bought up though, it's in Texas. So one of your audience members picked up on the fact that this is very schematic and kind of, there's these sort of roots in design to Byzantine. So just go with me if you can't picture what I'm talking about. Basically, Proto-Renaissance murals and mosaics, the artists didn't know how to create things that were like really in the round, like chiaroscuro and painting and all that stuff. So instead they made shortcuts. So they made little lines for muscles and things like that. And the mid-century artists were really interested in this. So they wanted to reinvigorate kind of what was becoming an archaic language and dismissed by critics, you know, after World War II, because we're getting into abstraction. So they're trying to be hip. And the Germans are trying to be hip. So what is this figure?
Jesus?
This is not Minerva Columbia.
No, it's Christ.
It's Christ.
I mean, it's very clearly Christ.
It's very clearly
It's
Jesus
that-
Christ.
I don't know what year that was.
1960s.
Well,
So
it's interesting because it's very much, when you look back at earlier styles, 30s, 40s of the German style, there's a lot of that repeating.
totally. So this is all kind of born out of the 20s and 30s. This is really Art Deco. If you think about buildings, this is like the mosaic painting version of Art Deco. And what I like about the American versus the German is how clearly opposed they are. Even though these artists are clearly thinking the same things, the messages are vastly different. So on the left, how do we know it's the United States?
Rose.
White marble, and it's in that Latin cross.
For heaven's sakes. It's not
And we were the victors.
Appropriate that the Germans, I mean, they...
Right, exactly. So the politics are really front and foremost in these artists' design, right? So here you've got, interestingly, this is this is Marigny, but Lacombe is the same kind of design. So can you guys see this? These grids. Every box is German. Every black dot is American. The American and German soldiers, when they first died, were buried together in Lacombe. It figures, right? You have dead bodies, you have to put them into the ground. And the American Graves Registration Service were doing the work, mostly African Americans, right? Mm-hmm. So when, in the 1960s, the Germans reconfigure everything to their own design. So it's not just a temporary looking American cemetery anymore with Germans, it's actually German permanent design. They put two soldiers to the same space that Americans used to have for one. Does that make sense?
Wait a minute.
Yes? So Germans are taking, Americans took up twice the amount of space in their grave burial plot than Germans did. Germans have more dead buried in the ground per space than the United States used to take. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
So here you have your La Combe. This is when it was a temporary American cemetery before they redesigned it. Now imagine Germany, vanquished, they can't do their own, they can't pay for their own national cemeteries. They have to have a private organization do this because nationalism in Germany is now forbidden, right? So this is the ultimate, so it's going through stages. This is La Combe when it's being built, and you can notice the 5, this is basically all you see as a headstone. So you think, oh, there's only 5 guys buried there. Not that many. Is that true? No. They used the landscape to mask the number of dead bodies of soldiers that were there fighting. Because we remember the plots, how many men were actually buried, right? Twice the amount. And they, using their Nazi original design for the Tottenberg, which means the fortress of the dead, they are doing this in La Combe as well, and sort of in the near Mont Saint-Michel. I almost forgot that. So, private organization, the Volksbund, Kriegsgrabeversuche from Germany, is sending out these guys, and they're like little detectives. They're pretending to be tourists in the 50s, and they're finding and reporting back about all these random graves that are not cared for all over Normandy. And they're making photos, and they're taking records, and they're saying, hey, you know, this is a really problem, this is a big problem for us. What are we gonna do? And so that's when they start basically figuring out, okay, we've got to redesign these cemeteries, we've got to get this really great architect on board, Robert Schindler, and make some strides. And this is what they did. So they went from left to right. And again, La Combe has gone through all sorts of iterations of landscaping. So it's kind of interesting to see how they're masking the number of buried soldiers. But you can see how many there were, much more clearly. Although the white were American and the dark were German. Does that make sense? The white crosses were American soldiers and the black crosses were German. So our American war cemeteries, a triumph. All of this was happening when France was named by the precursor to the Marshall Report in 1947 as the key battlefield for Western Europe in the fight against communism. France was the key battlefield. So it says, U.S. rushed aid to restore French industries. And here's the communist guy sitting on the French smokestack, right? And it says, French industries. So this is a great cartoon that I found in the University of Iowa's collections. So are you going to mess with communism if you live in Épinal? No. Maybe not. I mean, that's the hope. The American Battle Monuments Commission is using this art to say, hey, by the way, French people, we came in World War I, we came in World War II. Who's to say we're not going to come back again?
Or is it more, we sacrificed and we saved you, so you owe us something?
There's a lot of that built into it, too.
I always
Absolutely.
thought it was much more that.
I think it's a combination. I mean, who knows? We can't really say for sure. But if you trace the way in which the French used, so Le Maire was like this 1950s major politician in France, and he's using the Épinal American Cemetery to make speeches about the Algerian War, and he's actually justifying Philippeville, the massacre. So the discourse, the speech of Monsieur Le Maire justifies the right of France in its fight. And this is specific to the Algerian War, which we know is not, you know, some embarrassing moments for France. It's not exactly the best war to be proud of. And what I found interesting about this was that it's like an appropriation. It's taking the American message but appropriating it for the French. Not always in the ways that we would approve. So the lasting impressions, I found this really interesting. When I was doing field research in 2011, I was living in Normandy, and I was, driving. I had a little more money this time, so I was using a car, not walking, not getting rides from nice superintendents. But I found these really interesting notes about the Norman cemeteries. Like in 1954, during the Cold War, he said, so this is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. You would not be giving us freedom, but perhaps only skeletons and rubble. So he's referring to nuclear power, about American power.
That's not exactly what it said.
That's not what
Go
it
back.
Okay.
No cemetery in the world would be big enough to hold the victims of an atomic conflict.
Perfect.
So that's a little bit
True, and I should have clarified that I was quoting from the article itself. Thank you. And for whatever reason, I feel like we can kind of get what happens in the titles, but you guys don't have the time to read the articles. So here is the GIs are regarding the absence of de Gaulle. This is when French Gaullism is in its height in the 50th anniversary, and he didn't actually go to Normandy to commemorate in 1964, sorry, the 20th anniversary, not the 50th. And so I love Bolin because in his memoir, and he was the ambassador to France, a great politician, he said, for de Gaulle, the greatest amphibious military operation of all time was unhistory. So this is the French attitude about American war cemeteries, memory of World War II. I mean, obviously they're rebuilding their nation. They're kind of coming back with nationalism, trying to pull any strings together that they can. But in 1985, they're making graffiti. So, and that's obviously not correct. So these are neo-Nazi sort of right-wingers in France, but they're using the United States military cemetery as a way to promote their own propaganda. And this kind of simmering resentment is very much, I think, a part of Norman memory, especially recently. This is this is a commemoration of the inauguration of the German Orglan War Cemetery in Normandy, and look how well attended it is. I mean, I was there too, but I was more like, interesting.
What date was that?
This from 2011.
I understand. Remembrance Day is in November, but I see all the leaves on the trees. That's the reason I'm asking.
So that was in the spring, and it was the inauguration, or the summer, early summer. It was like the first day that the cemetery ever opened. And I don't know that date, so I apologize for that.
I see a lot of gray hair. It's interesting.
This is true. Exactly.
No, I don't mean to say that rudely.
No, it's a good point.
But it says which generation is touched by that.
Yeah, and it's French and German, but it's a lot of French, I saw. So the French, what did they witness on June 6, 1944? What did they survive that summer in Normandy? Bombardments, a lot of battle in their very backyard, destruction of Camp Saint-Lô, 95% of the city razed, right, by Allied bombardments, not even by German. So guys like this, this is in French, right? Vous les braves soldats allemands, vous avez fait moins de morts français que nos alliés, les ricains. So ricain is French slang for Americans. So it says, you, the brave German soldiers, killed less French citizens than our allies. The ricains, Caen, 15,000 deaths, Saint-Lô, Condé, Rouen, Le Havre, etc. And then he said, I witnessed the landings at Hermonville. It's true, right? So these French are starting to remember. This one lady, 7 members of her family were killed just in Saint-Lô, I believe. So, it's 7, so it's called. And this is where they're buried. So this is in Saint-Lô. You can't really see the inscriptions, but basically the French let the story tell itself. 9 bodies from the Rue de la Évolière, so the basement of Soudy, therefore Mr. Boulier and his children. They couldn't even identify the bodies, right? So there are all of these victim plots. So back to my framing questions, and then I will open, because we're at 46 minutes. How has the built environment affected the way in which politics are staged, communicated, framed, and received? How is this approach uniquely American? How do American war cemeteries compare with other nations, with cemeteries from other nations? And the conclusion, and I hope that you would agree, is that American war cemeteries have influenced diplomatic relations.
Great. So now we move on. We can applaud. That would be great. Yeah. So just the basic ground rules. We've got microphones that will be brought to you. We ask that you use the microphone. There's a little camera in the back. We want people who watch this to actually be able to hear you. So if you could use the microphone and identify yourself before you ask your question or make your very brief comment. So who would like to start us off? Why don't we start up here? The microphone is coming. It has arrived.
Thank you for your presentation.
You
I
are.
appreciate it. A question.
You are?
I'm Richard Garrison, retired Foreign Service officer. I was in Germany for 5 years. The question, how did these World War I cemeteries fare in Germany, in France, during the German occupation of France? And could you express an opinion on a more recent cemetery, in Berlin, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe?
Okay, these are good questions. So the Germans really were respectful of the American war cemeteries during World War II, and so there was very little damage except from bombs, like 1 or 2 shells in Amar. I think Lausanne had some damage, right, Tom?
Yeah, we did almost as much damage as like Germany. Well, as was the case in Normandy, Germans wanted to live there. We were the ones bringing the fight, so a lot of times the damage was done by our own, misfires or.
Oh, how interesting!
Yeah.
So was it American guns that accidentally fired into?
Yeah, General Patton demolished the mine at Mosaic, or did heavy damage to the mine at Mosaic.
Makes sense.
Had to be rebuilt.
It's a pretty important hill. And so that's, a lot of people wonder that, and there's a great chapter, chapter 5 of Thomas Connor's book, War and Remembrance, talks about the escape of the ABMC employees from France. It's very dramatic, and it's very good read. And the murdered Jews, I mean, I think that memorial is really moving. It's really, I mean, I made a special trip to make sure I visited, and I think it's important. It's good. It says a lot about saying a lot.
Standards?
Well, it's completely different visual language, right? Because it's totally different time era. But I like it. And I like the World War II memorial here in Washington, D.C. Because it's the same language that a lot of the veterans would have recognized. So a lot of people attack it for being kind of, Nazi looking, but I would disagree. Thank you.
Right over here, Professor Patton.
James Banner. Dr. Lemay, I've learned a lot from all that you've said, and I come at it from a particular perspective. I lived in Verdun, France for 2 years with the American Army, and one can't spend any time in Eastern France and not be deeply impressed by the cemeteries, German, French, American, Canadian, Belgian, and so forth and so on. They're all over the place. We're going back, most notably from 1870, the Franco-Prussian War through the Second World War. And what impressed me the most about my experience among those cemeteries was how the Americans had succeeded, how we had succeeded in beautifying death in our cemeteries. And at least the French never bothered with that. If anybody has ever been to Verdun and gone to the ossuary, it's sort of symbolic of the boneyard that Eastern France has been since, 876 or something like that. In tons of unidentified bodies thrown into the ossuary and just left there to stare you in the face. And there's no effort at prettifying it. So how does that difference in approach of the various cultures? And of course, it probably differs. I'm not as well acquainted with the cemeteries in Germany as I am the ones in France. But how does this aspect of these cemeteries reflect culture and perhaps design also?
I mean, so you mentioned the ossuary in Douaumont out in Verdun, and for me, I think that's much more, for someone who's never experienced war. I mean, my brother's a veteran, served in Iraq. I understand from the family point of view the cost of the sacrifice, but I've never seen it. So for me, I was actually much more impressed by the reality that the ossuary in France, in Verdun, demonstrates of what it meant to fight in trench warfare with that kind of incredible killing, that I resented, in a way, the beautifying of the American War Cemetery, because to me it smacks of propaganda. It smacks, and I mean that in one sense. I mean, I also love this American cemeteries too. Right. So there's a lot of, I've thought about this in a lot of different ways. But if you want to tease out those two, that sort of comparison, one's beautiful, but it doesn't get to the reality of war. It masks the reality of war, and it's absolutely specific to the Cold War. So there's a lot of kind of, and it's great to debate. I mean, this room, we're all fascinated by these cemeteries. And so getting back to the question, well, who built them? I mean, I was amazed. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on this, and nothing had been written about the ABMC or these incredible artists and architects. And historians, my pet peeve is when they put up illustrations and they don't actually say what the artist was or what it was called or when it was made. So there's a lot of good history out there about war and memory of war, but they're not looking at art, and it's just as important. And the Douaumont is very interesting. There's a lot of, we could talk more about the French and how they built that. The Americans paid for that phallus part of it. Okay, anyway.
Right up here.
The green sweater.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Claudine Schweber. I'm a management professor. My family's from France, and many of those, some of those that are in these cemeteries, the French ones would be some members. My question may be a little off. How do you, when you look at the French cemeteries, if you've had a chance, and then the Americans, what kinds of differences did you see? You already mentioned one, that it appeared that the French ones didn't get into which religion, or maybe I misunderstood.
The French did. They
did? Okay. So what other differences did you see, given that this happened on French soil?
Right. Well, that's a great point, because it, and I meant to say that to the previous question, the reason why the French used ferro concrete is because it was a cheap material. So they're devastated by not one, but 2 world wars. And there's a lot of, it's interesting, the French decided to, when in June 19, when the floating harbor in 1944 off of the English Channel in Normandy was destroyed off of Omaha Beach, the French, we decided to give that to the France and to give them the profits of using that as scrap metal to like sell off and use as they would, right? Instead, they created a whole commission to commemorate American sacrifice and the sacrifice of the Allies. When clearly they could have used that money. Le Havre was completely destroyed. Caen, Saint-Lô, we've already discussed the destruction of Normandy. So the French have this incredible responsibility. It's almost like this moral choice that they made to make sure that they remembered the sacrifices of their so-called saviors. And that's why their cemeteries really look bad. I mean, I think that the cemeteries speak to truth. It speaks to what their circumstances were. And I really like them for that. But if we want to be kind of art historians, I'm not going to study that for design? No.
Do any of the cemeteries give you a little historical plaque?
They do, yeah.
Background?
Yeah,
so
the French do.
Coming in know what the context.
Yes, and the ABMC has done an incredible job since 2006 when they opened the Normandy American Visitor Center in the Normandy American Cemetery. They've done a much better job than they ever have before with education. And I would recommend going to those visitors centers for sure.
Gentleman back here, standing.
Here's.
Wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Forgive me, this doesn't need to be a commercial, but my partner and I made the PBS National Primetime Film.
Yes. This is great, right?
Glenn.
Glenn, and thank you for
and it's
reaching out.
convinced PBS put it online for free. So if anyone wants to see a lot of the visuals that have been discussed, including the art and some campaign maps that are in some of the visitor centers, not to the extent that the new D-Day, the new Omaha Beach Normandy Cemetery is. It's free and it's online, so if you just put in PBS and the word hallowed grounds, it has an S on the end, there's a hallowed ground.
I've heard so many great things about this, and Glenn has been so good to email me twice, once during the shutdown, and then once more recently, and I'm so sorry I haven't gotten back to you.
That's all right. I have a DVD here for you, but
as I say, I know, I'm thrilled about this.
PBS agreed to put it online for free because of the importance of the veterans, of course, who are dying.
I've heard about this one, yeah.
Also, those are World War I cemeteries. But I'm not here for an advertising of those, because we get nothing for the clicks. So I just had the honor of doing this, and my uncle is buried in one of them, which is why we got such excellent access by the ABMC.
Where is he buried?
He's buried in Lorraine.
Yeah, the Lorraine.
Which is the closest cemetery to Germany. He was killed in Germany in 1945, 3 weeks before the war ends. But there are so many people who have stories equal or worse than that. But I do have a question. Forgive me, I stumbled in late. Did you discuss the alleged exchange between Dean Rusk and Charles de Gaulle at the instigation of President Johnson when he asked the NATO troops to leave?
Oh, yeah.
NATO troops, did that come up in the discussion?
No, but please.
Oh, I'm sorry. When de Gaulle wanted American troops out of France as part of his issue with NATO, and so he could have the force to front the nuclear, his own French-independent nuclear deterrent military presence. Rusk was going to meet with President de Gaulle, and Johnson, in this document, Johnson asked Rusk to tell de Gaulle, do you want us to remove all of our dead soldiers as well? Rusk resisted. He said, I don't think I'm going to do that. And Johnson said, I'm putting it in paper, it's a presidential order. And so apparently he said this to de Gaulle at the end of the meeting, and de Gaulle stood up and just left. He didn't have to say, although he could have said no, and you know, we saved your ass in the revolution, so let's not again. but he did.
It goes back and forth.
Yeah, not so. Anyway.
No, I appreciate that story.
It was a wonderful talk, and thank you to address things that no document filmmaker could ever address. You've gone so much deeper, and thank you.
My pleasure.
Great. Right up here.
Hi, I'm Brina Robertson. Been a fan of your work for a long time, so it's good to see it.
It's mutual. We were pre-doctoral fellows together at American Art Museum. So,
so I wanted to, I wondered if you might sort of expand a little bit on the relationship between, or sort of the decisions that go between the repatriation of the deceased bodies of loved ones versus the construction of these lovely cemeteries and how those have sort of become pilgrimage sites, and how sort of both of those operate within grieving, but then also cultural memory of war.
Wow, that's a good packed question. I love it. So I don't think that the families, at least for World War I, understood what they were signing up for when they decided to have their fallen loved one buried, permanently overseas. But I think that the World War II families, some of them knew, not a lot of them, from what I can understand. And I think that the power of the pilgrimage was demonstrated with the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages in the 30s, and they did them in segregated trips. So white mothers, were shipped across the ocean first class, given this incredible treatment in these beautiful hotels in Paris, and then they would go to the cemeteries where their sons, or most of them were mothers, where the sons are buried. And same thing for the African American mothers. So there's a lot of pilgrimage that you could study with the World War I. World War II, they didn't offer that option. I don't think they had the money. And because World War I, they got a lot of flack for that because it was the Depression. So there's, again, political, social context around these things. But I think today, for the veteran, to go to these cemeteries, I interviewed a lot of World War II veterans for this book, and oh, I love all the markings that you've made in your copy. And I got very close to one, Norwood Thomas, and I followed him during his pilgrimage in Normandy, and that was incredible because he, we pinpointed which field he jumped into, June 5th, and it was incredible to be with him, to learn from him, because it's a completely different experience than for me. Of course, I just go to the cemeteries and I think about my brother. So, when I don't have my art historian kind of cap on and thinking about everything else, because these places are so moving. You'd have to be really not a feeling person if you didn't find them important places. So as an art historian, that's why I was like, why were these places dismissed as bad art? Why were these places in the 60s and 50s argued over by New York City critics and dismissed as bad because they're still moving to this day? I don't think I answered your question really. Sorry.
So let me jump in on that point, because you raised an important issue, which is not everyone looked at these cemeteries and the art within them and came away awed or moved. So if you could talk, because you deal with this in the book,
right,
a bit more about contemporary responses to the cemeteries when they were open. You alluded to New York critics, but there are Paris critics as well. And then you have an intriguing line.
Oh boy.
that you might expand upon, and you say, there remains much to be written about the formal resemblance among fascist, Stalinist, and certain Western monumental works of the Cold War period. ... And some have seen, say, the World War II memorial, and have certain images come to mind, and some saw these cemeteries in the early Cold War period and seen resemblances to other architectural forms and came away less impressed. So we may find them moving today, and many may have found them moving at the time, but many also did not. So if you could talk to their responses and perhaps the similarities in this particular neoclassical design and why some contemporaries might have found it problematic.
So, okay, so World War II was ground shifting in terms of nuclear warfare. And a lot of people lost their religion, for example, right? Art lost its religion in a way too. So we're starting to think about, well, how are we supposed to even grapple with the new reality? All of this neoclassical mumbo jumbo of the Federal Triangle, of this very building we're in, this is antiquated language. It doesn't serve us today. These are the thoughts that were happening in the 1950s of these art critics. So the art critics are looking at works, just look outside and you'll see these neoclassical sculpture sort of on the buildings and the way that there's detail and decoration. It's interesting because at the time, the artists thought that they were being really hip. Like what I was talking about before with Savage and the Byzantine-inspired, schematic, Art Deco kind of murals. Architects were taking neoclassical designs and stripping them completely of their decoration in the 30s and 40s. And that was the really cool visual language that was signaling cutting-edge architecture at the time. So when you leave tonight, look at the Federal Triangle buildings and note which ones have more decoration than not. And you'll see which ones are slightly newer. So the Apex is the newest, right? Near the National Gallery of Art. That's got the least amount of decoration. We're probably in the most decorated area here in the Federal Triangle, with a lot of bas-relief kind of sculpture decorating the columns and that kind of thing. And like, you know, all those little, the metopes and the triglyphs all have little things in them. So the French could have cared less about the American war cemeteries, because the French were like, why do we even care about America? They just do borrowed design. They're not original, they're not innovative. New York stole the center of art, as Serge Gibault writes in his book, How New York Stole Modern Art. And so the French, you know, so in the contemporary moment when these cemeteries were built, the French still were in that mindset of, well, Paris is the, you know, only place where any kind of interesting artwork is happening. So then World War II happens, and all of the artists in New York City turn to abstraction. So think Jackson Pollock, drip paintings. I mean, there's no figure, and the figure gets really distinct, which is too bad for portraits. My colleagues will tell you in the portrait gallery. So there's that kind of thing. And then the art critics really hated the kind of borrowing of the language. They just thought it was unoriginal. Art critics in New York City. And they wrote about it in the New York Times and in places like Art News. These are very specific art magazines. And there's a whole fight between traditional kind of art makers who worked in this kind of style, the neoclassical style, but they stripped it down and they did what they thought was cool. And then the people that were trying to do new things, like the TWA terminal. Have you guys ever seen how that it's made out of ferroconcrete and it's very...
The Saarinen terminal.
Yeah, the Saarinen. That,
Saarinen, right.
Saarinen, yep. Eliel, I can never say his name. E-L-I-E-L, yeah. And Euro, Saarinen. Yeah. And of course, anyway, it's like, so those guys, if you've ever been to Columbus, Indiana, it's the mid-century architecture capital of the world. It's incredible, and that's the kind of architecture that was being produced and liked. So not using this traditional language. There's a big fight. Lloyd Goodrich of the Met is tasked by President Truman to create reports about how art and government is sponsored, how the government sponsors art. He produces all his kind of reports. It's really hard to read through. Another report was made, another report was made. And basically, the National Endowment for the Arts gets born out of this long process in the 60s. And that makes it so that this kind of art at the war cemeteries, these artists were basically tapped, like, hey, we went to school together, you married my sister, we're all on the Commission of Fine Arts, why don't you take this cemetery and I'll do the other one? So there's a good old boys club kind of thing going on with it. So, and they get called out on it, and it shapes the art world, you know, in the 60s. And I think the American war cemeteries are the key between this transition of saying goodbye, sort of this mid-century shift. You have to wonder, well, how did abstraction just kind of rear its head and come out of nowhere? It didn't just go from Federal Triangle buildings to the TWA terminal, right? There had to be some kind of dialogue. And the American war cemeteries from World War II are definitely at the heart of that dialogue. They are the shift.
Hand back right here.
Hi, I'm Don Thomas Franklin. I'm an Army wife. My husband was Chief of Staff in Europe for 18 years. And I just feel obligated to say that in the 18 years that we spent in France, I never heard one French person say anything negative about the cemeteries. They're proud of them. If you've ever gone on a Memorial Day, the French, the Dutch, everywhere are just thrilled. And there's a group called France Will Never Forget, so I hope that you will look into them. From my heart, I have to say that, because I feel as though it's kind of a negative vibe. So I never felt that in 18 years.
I didn't mean it to be negative. I just meant that the critics, like actual art critics, were not writing about this. But the French civilians, of course, they're really, really lovely hosts, you know, and I mean, Don, we met. I was on a Fulbright, and you and Wally were really nice to me. So I remember this. Yeah.
We'll make our way the very far back, and then we'll make our way forward.
Thanks.
Hi, Shannon Granville with Army Center Military History. In your travels throughout the American military cemeteries, did you have access to Plot E at Lausanne, the cemetery of the dishonorable dead? And from an architectural and sort of historical commemorative standpoint, the lack of monuments, just the numbered plots for those who were executed for generally rape and murder, from a art. How does that fit in with your narrative of what of sort of historical commemoration and just general memory?
So I'm just going to flip to a slide. I'm pretty sure I have a. So is it Shannon?
Shannon, yes.
Shannon's referring to this. This is Plot E, if it'll come up. So it's in Ferentardenois, which is the Lausanne American Cemetery. This is a World War I cemetery. Here's Paris. And you can see how the landscape is kind of built, not built, but these plants are in a square around what's known as Plot E. So there's 96 men buried, 72 were black, 13 were white, 2 were Hispanic, 1 was Navajo, and 8 are unknown. And more work has probably been done about this since murder, and they were buried in the plots along with the honored dead. Whereas World War II, the decision was, well, that doesn't feel right, so what do we do? I mean, war crime happens, okay? This is just a fact. And I think probably more perpetrators who weren't minorities got away with, that's why I list the racial sort of stats. I believe that these men probably did what they were found guilty of, but I'm not sure this is accurate. Oh, I've looked at the records. You should read my book. So there's a lot of discussion about this plot. It's clearly very sensitive. It's felt to be, the ABMC is not happy whenever I've been there and have asked to see it. So, and it casts a shadow over the sacrifice of all the other men. That's the problem. So you have to be very clear in how you approach talking about this, and I try to be as clear as possible. But of course, I write about it as like an unmemorial. It's a hidden landscape. It's really the French remember these things, and meanwhile, these happy American tourists don't understand why the French aren't thrilled about us. So there's a lot of this kind of simmering resentment amongst the French. That if you dig deep enough, they'll talk to you about it. And they might not talk to Dawn about it, but they would talk to me about it. So this is me being a young person that wasn't a diplomat. I didn't have any kind of presentation. So thank you for the question.
We can move right up here. There's a hand.
James Sang, amateur. Is it a good idea to mix what seems to be as 3 different problems? There's the memorializing of individuals, where you have a name and a body. There's the Verdun ossuary and the Luton's memorial for Somme, where you have bones and names uncorrelated. And then you have something like in Manila, the American Battlefield Memorial, which is 1/3 bodies and names, and 2/3 bodies with unidentified names and unidentified bodies, or a lot of names and people who were lost at sea. And aren't these kind of 3 different kinds of memorials?
Yeah.
And so you talk about almost one. Aren't there a lot of corners that we're missing?
Sure.
Here, so.
You should go write about it.
Okay. I'm a physicist, not a but the way we're talking about
yeah, and I appreciate the point. This is a big topic.
Yeah.
And
Scully talks about it a little bit in his book. I remember seeing Vincent Scully had a book on memorial architecture.
Yeah. He taught Maya, by the way, who then went on to design the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial. So he was
the Soul Memorial as being more emotional response to the magnets.
Up here, the microphone is coming.
The microphone is coming.
Actually, I needed to go back.
We need the microphone.
I'm Juliet Ward, former Foreign Service officer. I needed to go back to something that you said here, sit down. Okay, you're talking about the buildings, okay?
Right.
And you're talking about the monuments, and you're talking about how the fact that the architectural style moved from a classic style into a modern style. And so the critics didn't like the old style because it didn't reflect the new style. Is that right? But when we saw the pictures of the buildings, everything looked as if it was in the classic style. So did I miss something? You're talking about the period that those buildings were designed.
Yeah.
1955 to
1948 to 52.
52, okay. But that was pretty early for the modern style to have already come in.
Right.
So I'm not understanding how it happened on the
They were just starting. You're right. I mean, it's sort of the cusp. And it's interesting because if you look at some of the Lorraine American Cemetery, it has a really boxy kind of design, and it's very, very,
And does it
modern.
have any decoration on it?
Well, it has, yes, but it's not.
I can't remember. I think you showed that one to us.
I did, but it's going to take me a second here. But the decoration is just a statue that's been.
It's not with the classic.
It's not really. Let me show you. Here it is. You see the sort of the boxiness, and this is Saint Nabour. So it's interesting because the French patron saint of the Lorraine region was Saint Nabour from the Roman era, and so the American architect Thomas Locropt really wanted to make sure that he was sort of reaching out to the French in this diplomatic way. So he incorporated a saint that only the Nabourian people would understand. Americans see this and they're not quite sure what it is. But do you see how boxy this is? This is very, very modern.
Okay,
and
so
this was also the
that's
last
what you're calling modern then. But
sure.
I mean, when you talked to Jackson Pollock was a little later than that, but okay.
Well, he was working in the 40s. He wasn't famous until the 50s, but he was around.
Okay.
So this is very neoclassical.
Okay, so
you see how it's stripped down?
Yeah, okay. But those bas-reliefs are very much classic. I mean, in Mesopotamia, you would have.
Oh my gosh, she loved it. Yeah, and this whole Art Deco is
and the critics didn't like that.
Well, they would have in 1920.
But by the time they thought, okay, all right.
Yeah. No, it's really, really good questions because it's hard to understand.
I'm keeping you honest.
Well, I think I was honest throughout the presentation.
Well, if I could squeeze in here, could you give a little description on Soviet approach to this, as in Berlin, for example?
I know. I don't know enough about the Soviets really to comment. I bet you probably could, foreign service officers over there.
I've got another question. I have many questions, but I'll restrict myself here.
I feel like this is my dissertation defense. What am I doing? Oh my gosh.
It's a seminar. These are questions. We're exploring ideas. So at one point in the book, you introduced a concept that I confess I've not encountered before, and it's an interesting one, of remembrance priorities.
Oh, yeah.
And you refer to the destruction in Normandy, 20,000 dead from Allied bombing on the 5th, 6th, and beyond, and that Normans didn't commemorate that destruction, and that only became prevalent perhaps 50 years later. So if you could talk a little bit about the people of Normandy, their mourning, and their relationship to cemeteries and destruction, which is a theme that you address in the book in some detail.
Sure. No, and I'm sort of fascinated. So this is Simone Renaud, who was the wife of the mayor, André Renaud, in Saint-Mary's. And she is tending the grave of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., whom I mentioned before. Yeah. So you guys are all caught up with who that was. And it was published in Life magazine, as you see, Life down at the bottom, right, in 1944. And so all of these American mothers start writing to her these letters. And this is an archive that's really hard to get to because the Renaud family is protective. And so you can see on the right, and then the letter to Madame Renaud, and then on the left, you see her response. And apparently she wrote like 10 letters a day for 4 years. So there's a lot of American war graves being tended by French women. And I'm really interested in the kind of role that women have in performance of mourning and grieving, because they not only use these cemeteries in their everyday lives. This is this is Blauville, this is the Levesque family, and she was just confirmed in her religion. I think is one of these people. Well, actually, I have no idea who it was, but this is they just went to the cemetery for just the family portrait. This is where they wanted to be photographed. I was confusing it with another one. So when the temporary cemeteries were removed, Simone Renaud wrote poetry and published it, and was saying, leave them here, do not take from us the sweetness and the supreme pride to watch over their noble remains. And other women, this is Yvette Duboc, who you can see here, she's visiting in Indiana, in Carthage. Joe Porter, who was shot down, and she was part of the resistance, and she hid him. And she identified in his airplane the men that died. And so she's doing this kind of caretaking in a way. And this is in the archives of the Brittany American Cemetery. And so this is where they were first buried, in this area here. And she's decorating their graves in Troupe Mère de Grande. And then they were buried and removed to Normandy, and she couldn't make it that pilgrimage because it's like there's no gas in 1945 or 1949. Here's another site. This is the American Cemetery in Marigny, but it's gone. So they just have this incredible stele marking like where it used to be. So these French people are really interested in these temporary cemeteries, and they grieved over them when they were removed. And so basically I just kind of go on about why they were emotionally involved is because they themselves went through hell during the war, and then their own memorials to World War II were kind of tacked on to the World War I dead. And I already talked about the Victimes du Bombardement in Saint-Lô in this civilian cemetery, and this is the only memorial that I know of. There was another one, but I think it was taken down to the victims of civilian death. So there's a lot of, like if you go into the little cemeteries, little civilian cemeteries, this one was by one of the rapists, murderers. He killed a Frenchman and engraved on the side, and I kind of blacked it in so you could see it says tué par les noirs, which means killed by the blacks. So if you're in post-World War II Normandy, you understand that means Americans because those are the only black soldiers. I already talked about that. So I hope that answers your question.
Roger. You have a question? I'm sorry, Roger. Looking in the wrong direction.
Could you just tell us a little bit about the financing of all of this and how it changes over time?
Yeah, the finances were American tax dollars, and it basically had to be approved by Congress. And Thomas North was famous in Congress because he came in under budget. So he was like the one guy. But he had to negotiate a lot actually to make sure that he was getting the kind of funding that was allocated. And we all know about that. I mean, our government shuts down now, so I don't know what they did back then, if they had shutdowns or not. But does that answer your question? No. Yeah.
We have time for one short question. So the microphone coming, here it is.
Sure. Short question. When you say the graves were moved, and you have 4,000 graves that were moved, what did that entail and how did it take place?
Oh, that's a good question. So what that entailed was taking the graves, and do you see these black covered stacks? These were the coffins stacked up, and not to be published, by the way. Right, here I am publishing it. It's because it's so old, it's been declassified. But this is the Lorraine American Cemetery, and you can see, so these are the coffins that were ready to be, actually I have no idea if they were taken out and are stacked for repatriation. And then, do you remember the boat from Cherbourg? So that was one of the collection points, and then they shipped it overseas to permanent interment.
But they were all, oh, so those ones in the field where the stele was? You know where the picture you showed us of?
Right.
Okay. All those graves were taken out?
Yes.
And where did those go? Would they have been repatriated, or would they have gone into one of the grave sites, the larger grave?
62% or 64% were repatriated. And after World War I, 70% was repatriated.
Okay.
And then, and this is one of the arguments that they put out there as like, don't repatriate your boy because, you know, where the tree fell there, let it lie. Who said that? Anyone? Said Theodore Roosevelt about Quentin, when Quentin died. And so there's a whole, you know, Quentin's fountain, but then Theodore Roosevelt Jr. died, so Quentin got moved to Normandy to lay next to his brother. But there's a lot of that kind of, because this is disconcerting. These coffins were above ground for years. And so the American soldiers were waiting to be buried into the permanent designs. I mean, it takes a while for all this stuff to get, you know, the soil has to be, whatever the word is for water drainage. All the grading has to take place. I mean, it's just a huge operation. So they closed the cemeteries, and these French people couldn't walk through them, and they lost their like family picnic place and things like that. So it was an interest. I mean, if I could go back in time, I would love to go to the years 1944 to 49 to see what was happening in these cemeteries. It's pretty interesting. Thank you.
So on that note, I unfortunately have to draw this to a close, but I will remind you that you can come back next week when we'll have a somewhat different conversation when Stephen Kieminger talks about his new book, The Diplomacy of Détente, Cooperative Security from Schmidt to Schultz. Please join us right next door for a light reception, and I want to thank Clarke Lemay and our audience for today's discussion.